Child marriage is wrong. Presumably we all agree that. But do we agree what we mean by child marriage? The label child bride conjures up images that are quite disturbing. But do these images speak to the experiences of 17-year-olds? I want to talk to you about how campaigns to rigidly impose 18 as the minimum age for marriage are actually failing young women. This focus on age limits can cause young women harm and almost always distracts attention from the real problems that they face. A couple of years ago, I was at a roundtable discussion at a conference on child-sensitive social protection in Harare, in Zimbabwe. The roundtable was focused on child marriages, and participant after participant stood up and vented their outrage. Child marriage is wrong. Zimbabwe should ban child marriage. It should severely prosecute those who are responsible. Anyone who is under 18 is a child, and a child can't possibly consent to marriage. So marriage to someone under 18 is child sexual abuse. It needs to be seriously punished. No one demurred. I sat on the edge of the room feeling rather detached from this discussion. I was definitely an onlooker, not a participant. That was not because I had nothing to say, but I didn't think that my perspective was likely to be heard in the midst of a rising moral panic. Going round in my head were the voices of young women that I'd interviewed in Lesotho and Malawi. Mapoka in Lesotho had talked about her marriage as the saddest moment in her life. She had to leave school. She had to struggle hard to find food for her new family. She had to cope without her mother in her new home. And neither her in-laws nor even her husband offered her any help. Other girls in Lesotho painted a similar picture of their marriages. Lesotho is a place where young women are expected to live with their in-laws when they marry. Often they find themselves in a village they've never previously visited. Their husbands are expected to support them financially, and in the past, when young men were able to find work in the mines in South Africa, that wasn't a problem. But today, jobs are scarce, and few men have regular income. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Basotho women's experiences of marriage were almost universally negative. On the other hand, there was Limnile. Limnile was from Malawi, and she said that marriage had changed her life for the better. She'd actually married under pressure from her mother, but in her words, at the beginning, if I'd known it would be like this, I would have said, "Lord, thank you." In Malawi, young men come and live with their wives when they marry. They build a house and they live separately from the parents, and they work together on the woman's field. And in Malawi, many of the young women referred to their marriage as the happiest event in their life. Mapoka and Limnile were just two among dozens of young research participants whose accounts I'd been reading. Most of these young women had married in their mid to late teens, but I hadn't been reading their accounts as stories of child marriage. I didn't actually know precisely how old these young women were. And in many cases, neither did they. When she was asked, Mapoka just responded, "I was 17, 18, I'm not sure." Chronological age simply didn't figure in their accounts. So these weren't stories of child marriage. They were stories about the social pressures and the cultural practices surrounding marriage in communities where the young women lived. Whether the girls were 17 or 18 wasn't significant. The conference in Harare was an instance of a much wider global campaign to prohibit marriage below the age of 18. Let's look at what's happening. The Girls Not Brides campaign has brought together over 800 civil society organisations from around the world. Note the image of the child bride on Plan's website. Likewise, the World Bank's recent homepage. Global Citizen is campaigning on the issue. And UNFPA declares child marriage to be a human rights violation. And this discourse isn't restricted to NGOs. Gaffney Rees, writing in 2011 in the International Journal of Human Rights, asserts that child marriage is in effect already prohibited under international human rights law because it infringes rights to education, to be free from torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and it constitutes a practice similar to slavery. The idea that a young woman who's married at the age of 17 to her 19-year-old boyfriend should automatically be understood as a victim of torture or something similar to slavery is patently ridiculous. But is imposing 18 as a minimum age for marriage universally actually harmful? I argue that it can be. Those of us who've been married know that it's not always easy, and I'm not saying that teenage marriage is by any means ideal. A young bride may have married to relieve her parents of the costs of providing for her. Perhaps like Lim Neely, she may have done so under pressure. She may have had to leave school, she may have borne children, which made it hard to pursue employment away from home. There are often negative associations with teenage marriage, and sometimes these certainly amount to abuse. But for young women in contexts where there's no access to an independent income, where parents want to refocus their resources on younger, more dependent offspring, where schooling offers few prospects for the future, early marriage can make sense. Marriage may offer economic security, an opportunity to pursue a livelihood independent of parents, protection even from an abusive home life. The problem that these young women face isn't the age at which they're allowed to be married. It's the poverty and the limited prospects that they face. The setting in which marriage occurs is a crucial part of the story. A crucial part of what determines whether it's harmful or not. Marriage may be much safer than other livelihood options that are available to young women with minimal education. And it's not just the economic setting. Calls for a universal minimum age of marriage assume that marriage is a universal phenomenon. It isn't. Marriage is a very different practice in different places. The formality and respect that's attached to marriage can be a problem, but in some societies it's valuable to young women. If a girl's pregnant, marriage may allow her to raise her child with the support of a father and in a socially sanctioned relationship, without the stigma and the social disadvantage that's attached to teenage motherhood. And in societies where sex outside marriage is unacceptable, it's hard to ban marriage without also banning sex. And legislating against teenagers having sex can raise even deeper problems. Uganda recently amended its defilement law, raising the age of consent for girls to 18, supposedly to prevent sexual exploitation. It increased the maximum sentence to death by hanging. In practice, the average age of men prosecuted under this new law is 21. Prohibiting sex below the age of 18 also makes it almost impossible to deliver sexual and reproductive health services. That's a situation that can easily put young women's lives at risk. Marriage consists of different elements: economic transaction, relocation, social roles, power geometries. These take different forms in different places. In some contexts, they come together in ways that are oppressive, but not everywhere. Even somewhere like Lesotho, where marriages are often problematic, there's little to be gained by making young women wait until they're 18 in order to get married. Here it's the social construction of marriage that causes problems. The requirement to pay bride wealth means that men can't marry until they're older. And when they do, they feel that the payment entitles them to loyalty and obedience from their wives. And it's this that makes young women vulnerable. But the international community isn't campaigning for changes in how marriage is constituted. It doesn't dare. It's campaigning for governments to prohibit marriage among young people. And that's partly because international intervention in relation to young people under the age of 18 is considered legitimate. It's supported by the universal doctrine of child rights. It may surprise you to learn how recently child marriage has become framed as a child rights issue. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child may be largely responsible for universalising the idea that anyone under the age of 18 is a child, but none of its articles refers to marriage. That didn't stop the Committee on the Rights of the Child in its 2017 General Comment on Adolescence from reaffirming that the minimum age for marriage should be 18. The problem with using a discourse of child rights is that it means shoehorning teenagers into concepts of victimhood that have been developed in relation to young children. Let's look again at those images of child brides. The popular story of a young girl victim sexually exploited by an older male culprit. This bears no relation to the experiences of either Limnile or Mapoka. And if this is the basis for action, it risks neglecting young women's real needs. Protecting them from adult activities may be preventing them from responding to difficult situations in ways that could serve their own interests. So why is this happening? Why is there such a drive to entrench a rigid threshold between childhood and adulthood and to legislate to restrict those beneath it? Why the drive to colonise an age category? Doubtless, it partly reflects the interests of NGOs. Many NGOs focus either exclusively or in part on children, and they're predisposed to constantly seek out new terrain for campaigning. At a superficial level, the inclusion of all under 18s in statistical measures of, for instance, child marriage, inflates numbers. It emphasises and perhaps exaggerates the scale of the problem. So according to UN Women, 1 in 3 women in the Global South is married before the age of 18. Now that's a seriously large-scale problem to be working on. NGOs also want to tell a simple story, a story that can be told worldwide, that has a straightforward solution. And securing legislative change is relatively straightforward. The financial cost is low. Results are easily demonstrated, change is legislated, marriage rates fall. When Malawi raised its minimum marriage age to 18 last year, it was celebrated by NGOs. But did it serve young women like Limnile? Dealing with poverty, by contrast, is much more challenging and much harder to demonstrate success. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not suggesting that there aren't abhorrent practices taking place that need to be addressed. My question is whether it's appropriate to use a media image of a prepubescent child bride from a particular social context as the basis for restricting marriage to those aged 18 or older everywhere. Ultimately, it's seldom whether or not young people are 18 when they marry that shapes their experience, or determines whether marriage is harmful. Legislating 18 as a minimum age, in fact, risks denying young people a potentially valuable option, as well as demonising parents and young men. Rather than blaming individuals, it's marriage practices and structural conditions of poverty and limited prospects that need to be addressed. Responses to problems associated with marriage among young people need to take account of contexts and complexity They need to relate to the form that marriage takes in different places, and the social and economic processes that drive young people to marry. If marriage is not the same everywhere, a universal response cannot be justified.